They didn't announce it. They didn't explain it. They didn't warn anyone. They just erased two names. And if you're thinking, that can't be right. Children tied to Princess Diana's bloodline, quietly removed from one of Britain's most storied aristocratic families. Then ask yourself this first. Why would the Spencer family do something so drastic, unless they believed something far bigger was already in motion? That's the question nobody is asking loudly enough. Because what if this wasn't cruelty? What if it wasn't punishment? What if it was preemption? What if, behind closed doors, one of the most guarded families in Britain decided they were being maneuvered and cut the cord before the trap could snap shut? This story doesn't start with Meghan. It doesn't start with Harry. And it doesn't start with two innocent children whose names carry global emotional weight. It starts with fear. Old money fear. Old blood fear. The kind of fear that doesn't shout, doesn't post, doesn't leak. It simply acts. And once it acts, it never reverses course. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Ask yourself something uncomfortable right now. Why do you think this decision, if true, happened quietly? Why no press release? Why no denial? Why no carefully worded family sources briefings? Because the most powerful families don't explain themselves. They close doors. And today, we're talking about a door that may have been sealed permanently. For decades, the Spencer family has lived by one rule above all others. Discretion protects legacy. Not attention, not emotion, not popularity. Legacy. This isn't a Hollywood dynasty where surnames are brand extensions and grandchildren are marketing opportunities. This is Old England. Titles, estates, trusts, private clauses written so carefully they can't be challenged without detonating reputations. And here's the part that shocks people when they first hear it. Inheritance in families like this is not automatic. It's not sentimental. And it is absolutely not democratic. You don't inherit because the public thinks you should. You inherit because the family allows it. Which brings us to the question that changes everything. What happens when a family believes its legacy is being used, not honored? Suddenly, the children everyone assumed were untouchable aren't. Archie Harrison, Lillibet Diana, two names that carry extraordinary symbolism. One linked to royal lineage, the other to one of the most emotionally charged figures in modern history. Names chosen with intention. Names that mean something. But symbolism has no standing in a solicitor's office. Paper does. And according to whispers that refuse to die, paper may be exactly what decided their fate. Here's where the public narrative and private reality violently collide. Most people assume that because these children are related to Princess Diana, some piece of the Spencer legacy automatically belongs to them. A trust, a future claim, a symbolic inheritance that would one day be theirs by birthright. That assumption is wrong. And the Spencers know it. In aristocratic families, lineage isn't just about blood. It's about proximity, participation, alignment, and above all, intent. You see, the Spencer family doesn't just protect money. They protect narrative. They guard history the way museums guard artifacts. Nothing leaves without permission. Nothing is used without context. Nothing is repurposed for a different story. So imagine being in their position. Imagine watching the Diana legacy become a global brand again. Imagine seeing her name, her memory, her symbolism repeatedly invoked in media, speeches, branding, and emotional appeals. Then imagine realizing something far more unsettling. What if those invocations weren't just emotional, but strategic? What if the family believed that Diana's legacy was being positioned as leverage, not remembrance? This is where the story shifts from gossip to motive. Because families like the Spencers don't react to tabloids. They react to patterns. Patterns like timing. Patterns like naming. Patterns like repeated public emphasis on lineage. Patterns like the subtle suggestion that Diana's family, not the crown, might one day be the more sympathetic source of legitimacy, wealth, or narrative authority. Ask yourself this. If you were the guardian of a historic family legacy and you believed someone was positioning themselves, or their children, as emotional heirs to that legacy in the court of public opinion, would you wait? Or would you act quietly, legally, and irreversibly? This is why the alleged removal matters. Not because of what was lost, but because of what was prevented. Inheritance, in families like this, is not a gift. It's a permission slip. And permissions can be revoked before they're ever granted. What makes this story even more explosive is the timing. Why now? Why not years ago? Why not at birth? Why not when the children were named? Because timing reveals intent. The alleged decision didn't come during celebration. It didn't come during mourning. It came during a moment of recalibration, a moment when narratives were shifting, when brand identities were solidifying, when future projects, documentaries, memoirs, and legacy-building efforts were quietly lining up like dominoes. And the Spencers, if the whispers are true, saw the chain reaction before it started. There's another uncomfortable truth people don't want to confront. Children don't need to do anything wrong to be excluded. In aristocratic inheritance law, exclusion is often about preventing future conflict, not punishing present behavior. It's about removing ambiguity. And ambiguity is dangerous when legacies are involved. Because once a child is symbolically associated with a family legacy in the public imagination, disentangling that association becomes nearly impossible unless you do it early, cleanly, legally, without commentary. Which brings us to the silence. No Spencer statement, no outraged rebuttal, no emotional interviews, just silence. And silence, in families like this, is not uncertainty. It's confidence. Think about how unusual that is in a media environment where denial is instant and outrage is currency. Silence only works when you know the paperwork is airtight. So what exactly might have been done? Not a dramatic well reading, not a public exclusion, not a declaration of rejection. Something far more subtle. A clause, a trust adjustment, a future beneficiary reclassification. The kind of change that doesn't make headlines until someone notices what isn't there anymore. And that's the detail that reportedly stunned insiders. The absence. Names expected to appear didn't. And once they didn't, the assumption collapsed. Because you can't contest what you were never promised. Now here's where emotions get tangled, and understandably so. People hear this story and immediately jump to outrage on behalf of the children. As if they've been punished. As if they've been rejected. As if they've been told they don't belong. But that interpretation misunderstands aristocratic reality. Exclusion from inheritance is not exclusion from family. It's exclusion from obligation. And sometimes, families do that to protect children, not hurt them. But there's another layer that makes this impossible to ignore. If the Spencers acted preemptively, then they believed something bigger was coming. Not a request, not a conversation, a claim, a narrative claim, a future moment where Diana's legacy would be positioned as something that could be inherited emotionally, symbolically, and perhaps even materially, outside the Spencer family's control. And that is the one thing they cannot allow. Because once a legacy becomes transferable through public sympathy rather than legal structure, it's no longer a legacy. It's a weapon. So ask yourself, is it possible this wasn't about Meghan at all, but about preventing a future where the Spencer family would be pressured, publicly and morally, into acknowledging an inheritance they never agreed to? Is it possible this was the quietest way to say no forever? And if that's true, then the most shocking part of this story isn't that two names were removed. It's that the decision may have been made long before anyone noticed. Because families like this don't wait for headlines to force their hand. They move first. And once they do, there is no appeal court for legacy. Only history. But here's the twist most people miss. This decision, if real, didn't just shut one door. It set a precedent. A precedent that raises a far more dangerous question for everyone involved. If the Spencer family felt the need to act this decisively, what exactly were they trying to stop? Because whatever it was, it scared them enough to redraw the future. We're going to step back, far back, into the Spencer bloodline itself. Because once you understand how this family decides who belongs and who doesn't, you'll realize this outcome may have been inevitable from the very beginning. Why does one family decide who belongs, while the world assumes everyone does? That's the uncomfortable question hanging in the air as we step backward, not days, not years, but centuries, into the Spencer bloodline itself. Because once you understand how this family thinks about inheritance, identity, and control, the shock fades and inevitability takes its place. The Spencers don't operate like modern celebrities. They don't operate like royals bound by public protocol. They operate like custodians. Custodians of land. Custodians of history. Custodians of a name that existed long before cameras, headlines, or social media outrage. And in families like this, Inheritance is never about affection. It's about alignment. Ask yourself this. How many families do you know where a surname alone is worth millions, not in cash, but in influence? That's what the Spencer name represents. For generations, the Spencer family has treated inheritance not as a reward, but as a responsibility. Estates aren't passed down to whoever tugs hardest at public heartstrings. They're passed down to whoever preserves continuity. That's the first contradiction most people struggle to accept. Emotion weakens legacy. Distance preserves it. The further removed someone is from the family's internal ecosystem, its rituals, expectations, and unspoken rules, the less likely they are to be entrusted with anything of substance. Blood is just the entry ticket. Participation is the price. Now let's strip away the fantasy version of aristocracy and talk reality. In families like the Spencers, inheritance is fragmented by design. There isn't one pot of gold. There are layers: private trusts, conditional trusts, lifetime interests, discretionary beneficiaries, and silent exclusions that never appear in public records. Here's the part that surprises people. You don't get written out of a will to be excluded. You're simply never written in. And that difference changes everything. Because you can contest removal. You can't contest absence. That's why so many inheritance decisions are made years in advance, long before the public narrative catches up. Now think about the Spencer family's lived experience. They watched Diana become the most photographed woman in the world. They watched her story escape their control. They watched her life, her marriage, her death become global property. And they learned a brutal lesson from it. Once a narrative leaves the family, you never get it back. That trauma sits at the core of every Spencer decision today. So when people ask, why would the Spencers be so cautious? Why so protective? Why so controlling? The answer is simple. They already lost Diana once, and they refuse to lose her again. This is where the public misreads Earl Spencer. He's often framed as emotional, sentimental, protective to the point of stubbornness. But insiders describe him differently. Methodical, institutional, obsessed with precedent. A man who understands that once one exception is made, the entire structure begins to wobble. Because aristocratic families don't fear scandal. They fear dilution. Dilution happens when legacy becomes negotiable, when lineage becomes flexible, when emotional arguments begin to override legal frameworks. And that's exactly what modern celebrity culture does best. It turns sentiment into leverage. Now here's the part people rarely consider. Princess Diana's children were never Spencer heirs. They were Windsor heirs. That distinction matters more than anyone likes to admit. The Spencer legacy did not pass to William or Harry in any material sense. It remained with the family line, with the estate, with the custodians. Diana's children inherited her love, her memory, her symbolism, not her family's assets. And that line has never blurred. Until now. Because suddenly, Diana's name is not just memory. It's currency. It appears in branding, in storytelling, in public sympathy campaigns, in emotional positioning. And the Spencer family saw something forming that made them deeply uncomfortable. A narrative where Diana's legacy might be claimed not through the Spencers, but around them. That's the threat. Not money, not property, narrative displacement. Imagine waking up one day and realizing that the public believes someone else speaks for your family history. That's when families act. Quietly, legally, decisively. This is where the children enter the conversation, not as people, but as symbols. Archie and Lillibet didn't create this situation. They were placed inside it. Their names alone triggered alarm bells. One named Harrison, echoing royal tradition. The other named Diana, anchoring emotional continuity. Symbolically brilliant, strategically powerful. But to the Spencers, symbols are dangerous when they move faster than consent. Because symbols don't ask permission. They claim space. And once claimed, that space is nearly impossible to reclaim without looking cruel. Unless you act early, before expectations harden into entitlement. This is why the idea of they'll inherit someday had to be neutralized before it became accepted truth. Because once the public believes something is inevitable, denying it becomes a scandal. But denying it before belief solidifies? That's just administration. Now think about how aristocratic families handle risk. They don't wait for confrontation. They eliminate it. They don't argue publicly. They resolve privately. They don't issue statements. They revise documents. And this is why the alleged decision to exclude wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. A line added here. A category removed there. A beneficiary list finalized without ambiguity. Nothing to contest. Nothing to debate. Nothing to explain. Just clarity. And clarity is power. There's another layer that makes this even more uncomfortable. In families like the Spencers, inheritance isn't just about who gets something. It's about who doesn't get to influence something. Influence over estates. Influence over memorials. Influence over foundations. Influence over how history is framed. Once you're a beneficiary, even symbolically, you have standing. Once you have standing, you have leverage. And leverage is exactly what the Spencers refuse to hand over, especially to anyone outside their internal circle. Now ask yourself, if this decision were about punishment, wouldn't it be loud? If it were about rejection, wouldn't it be emotional? If it were about conflict, wouldn't there be leaks? Instead, there's silence. Silence means consensus. And consensus in families like this is rare, unless the threat is real. Which brings us to the part nobody wants to say out loud. This wasn't about children. It was about future adults. Adults who could one day speak, one day claim, one day align with narratives the Spencers cannot control. This was about removing that possibility before it ever matured. Harsh? Maybe. Effective? Absolutely. Because the Spencer family doesn't believe in future negotiations. They believe in permanent architecture. Once the structure is set, no amount of emotion can tear it down. And that's why this story matters far beyond gossip. It reveals how power actually works when cameras are off. It shows that the most decisive moves are the quiet ones. And it explains why the world found out too late to react. Because by the time people noticed what was missing, the decision was already years old. But here's the detail that changes everything. This wasn't the first time the Spencers drew a hard line. They've done it before. With distant relatives. With estranged branches. With family members who drifted too far from the core. The rule is simple. If you're not inside the system, you don't inherit the system. And distance, physical, cultural, ideological, counts. Which leads us to the next uncomfortable question. If the Spencer family was willing to exclude children tied to Diana's bloodline, what does that say about how serious they were about protecting what remains? And more importantly, who else do they believe might try to claim it next? Because once you understand how this family thinks, you start to see this wasn't a reaction. It was a warning. And in the next section, we're going to look at the one thing the Spencers guard more fiercely than money. Princess Diana's name itself. Because when legacy becomes currency, families don't just protect assets. They protect meaning. And what happened when they believed that meaning was being repurposed is where this story truly explodes. Who really owns a name once the world decides it belongs to everyone? That's the question the Spencer family has lived with for nearly 3 decades. And it's the question that explains why this situation escalated from quiet concern to decisive action. Because when we talk about inheritance, most people picture money, estates, trusts, property. But for the Spencers, the most valuable asset was never financial. It was Diana, not the woman they loved, not the sister, daughter, or mother. The symbol. And symbols are far harder to protect than land. After her death, the Spencer family learned a painful truth very quickly. Once Diana's name entered the global consciousness as something bigger than a person, it stopped belonging to them in the way it used to. Suddenly, everyone had a claim. The media, the monarchy, charities, biographers, filmmakers, strangers who felt they knew her. And over time, something else happened. Diana's name became portable. It could be attached to causes, to narratives, to identities. And once that happens, control is gone. This is where the public often misunderstands the tension between the Spencers and the wider royal narrative. The Spencers never controlled Diana's public image after her death, but they retained one thing fiercely: authority over her legacy. Who speaks for her? Who frames her memory? Who decides what her story means? That authority doesn't come from popularity. It comes from proximity, from being the last family standing when the cameras leave. So when Diana's name resurfaces repeatedly in new contexts, new projects, and new storylines, the family doesn't react emotionally. They assess risk. And here's the risk that changed everything. Diana's name was no longer just being remembered. It was being positioned. Positioned as moral leverage. Positioned as emotional continuity. positioned as an alternative source of legitimacy when other institutions lost public trust. That's when legacy becomes currency, and currency invites competition. Ask yourself, now imagine being Earl Spencer, watching this unfold, not through headlines, but through patterns. Repeated invocations of Diana's suffering, carefully chosen language about history repeating itself, subtle parallels drawn between past and present, none of it explicit, all of it cumulative. You don't need a contract to see where that road leads. Because once the public accepts a narrative, it becomes very difficult to contradict it without appearing cruel. And families like the Spencers don't allow themselves to be cornered by sentiment. They move first. This is the contradiction people struggle with. The Spencers are emotional about Diana, but they are ruthless about protecting her story. Those two things can coexist. In fact, in families like this, they must. Because letting her legacy drift into public ownership would mean losing the last thing they still control. Meaning, now let's address the elephant in the room. Why would the Spencers fear association with children? They wouldn't. They fear association with agendas. And agendas don't announce themselves. They develop quietly, through repetition, through symbolism, through carefully curated narratives that gain traction over time. And once traction turns into expectation, the damage is done. That's why the alleged inheritance decision wasn't reactive. It was preventative. The Spencer family didn't want to wake up one day to a world where they were expected, morally, publicly, emotionally, to acknowledge heirs they never consented to. Because consent matters in aristocratic legacy, and silence is not consent. There's another layer that makes this even more sensitive. Princess Diana's legacy is unique. Unlike most aristocratic figures, her memory is not confined to family circles. It lives in the public emotional bloodstream. That makes it volatile. And volatility demands containment. If the Spencers allowed even the perception that Diana's legacy could be inherited, extended, or reinterpreted without their involvement, they would lose the final say forever. So they drew a line. Not publicly, not emotionally, structurally. This is where the alleged exclusion of Archie and Lillibet stops being about them and starts being about everyone else. Because the decision sends a message. Diana's legacy does not transfer automatically. It is not inherited by naming. It is not activated by public sympathy. It remains with those who guard it. That message wasn't meant for tabloids. It was meant for anyone watching closely enough to understand. And someone was. Now here's where Meghan Markle enters the story in a way that's impossible to ignore. Not as a villain, not as a mastermind, but as a catalyst. Meghan understands narrative. She understands symbolism. She understands how stories shape power. And the Spencers know that. Whether intentional or not, the repeated alignment with Diana's story changed the risk calculus. Because the Spencer family doesn't trust coincidence when patterns form. They trust precedent. And the precedent they feared most was this. A future where Diana's legacy becomes a bargaining chip in public disputes. A future where her name is invoked not in memory, but in strategy. A future where the Spencer family is pressured to validate narratives they didn't create. That future had to be stopped. So they did what aristocratic families have always done when faced with existential risk. They closed ranks. They reviewed documents. They removed ambiguity. And they made sure that when the question eventually arises, who inherits Diana's legacy? The answer is legally boring. Because boring is safe. Boring doesn't trend. Boring doesn't outrage. Boring doesn't invite debate. Boring just exists. And that's exactly what the Spencers wanted. No room for interpretation. No room for emotional leverage. No room for future claims. Just finality. Now let's pause and ask the question most people are avoiding. If the Spencer family went this far to protect Diana's name, what do they know that the public doesn't? Because families don't fortify assets unless they anticipate pressure. And pressure doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from moments that haven't happened yet. Projects not yet announced. Narratives not yet revealed. Stories not yet told. The Spencers acted as if something was coming. And they didn't want to be caught unprepared. That's the part that should make you uneasy. Because this decision wasn't about yesterday. It was about tomorrow. about preventing a future where Diana's legacy could be contested emotionally, morally, or symbolically. And when you understand that, the alleged exclusion stops looking cruel. It starts looking calculated, which leads us to the next section. Because once you accept that this was about control, not punishment, the next question becomes unavoidable. Why did the Spencer family act now, instead of waiting? What changed in the timeline that forced their hand? Because something did. And whatever it was, it accelerated this decision from theory to execution. In the next chapter, we're going to examine the timing, not the headlines, the internal clock. And once you see what lined up behind the scenes, you'll understand why the Spencers believed waiting was the most dangerous option of all. Why now? That's the question that refuses to sit still. Because if the Spencer family has always been this protective, always this cautious, always this deliberate, why did this decision crystallize when it did? Why not years earlier, when the children were born? Why not immediately after the naming announcements? Why not during the height of public sympathy? Timing exposes motive. And timing, in this case, is everything. Families like the Spencers don't operate on media cycles. They operate on internal clocks. Quiet calendars marked not by headlines, but by thresholds. Moments when something moves from theoretical risk to imminent reality. That's when action happens. So let's talk about what changed. Not publicly, privately. For years, Diana's legacy existed in a kind of emotional stasis. Revered, protected, referenced, but largely contained. The family could tolerate occasional invocations. They could tolerate comparisons. They could tolerate memory being stirred. Because memory, on its own, doesn't threaten control. But then the tone shifted. Suddenly, Diana wasn't just being remembered. She was being recontextualized. Her story began appearing as a parallel. Her suffering reframed as a template. Her legacy subtly repositioned as unfinished business. And unfinished business demands resolution. That's the moment families get nervous. Because unresolved narratives invite intervention. Ask yourself this. Why do people invoke Diana so often when discussing modern royal conflict? Because she represents something unresolved, something emotionally potent, something the public feels never received justice. And justice narratives don't stay symbolic for long. They evolve. They begin to demand outcomes. And outcomes require authority. Here's the shift the Spencers couldn't ignore. Diana's name stopped being a memory and started functioning as validation. Validation for grievances. Validation for positioning. Validation for moral authority. That's when the risk profile changes. Because once Diana becomes the emotional benchmark, anyone aligned with her story inherits credibility, whether the family consents or not. Now layer timing on top of that. Projects were lining up. Stories were being prepared. Long-form narratives, documentaries, memoirs, re-examinations of history. None of this requires a public announcement to be anticipated. Families like the Spencers see these waves coming long before they crash. And they ask a simple question. When this story is told, where do we stand? Do we become footnotes? Do we become supporting characters? Or do we retain custodianship? The worst outcome for a family like this isn't criticism. It's irrelevance. Now consider another pressure point. Children grow. And with growth comes voice. Archie and Lillibet are not babies anymore. They are future adults, future speakers, future symbols. Even if they never choose the spotlight will choose them. That inevitability terrifies custodians of legacy. Because once individuals gain agency, control evaporates. The Spencers weren't reacting to who the children are now. They were reacting to who they will become. That's why timing matters. This decision wasn't urgent when the children were infants. It became urgent as the idea of a future narrative solidified. A narrative where Diana's legacy could be extended, interpreted, or leveraged through the next generation. That's not something you fix later. Later is too late. Now let's talk about escalation. For years, the Spencers could remain passive. Observe, monitor, evaluate. But then patterns converged. The language hardened. The parallels intensified. The public framing sharpened. What once felt organic began to feel directional. And directional narratives scare institutions. Because direction implies destination. And destinations imply claims. Here's a hard truth. Aristocratic families don't fear accusations. They fear precedent. Because once one claim is normalized, others follow. Allow symbolic inheritance today, and tomorrow it becomes moral inheritance. Allow moral inheritance, and soon it becomes expectation. Allow expectation, and suddenly refusal looks like betrayal. That's the trap. And the only way to avoid it is to remove the ladder before anyone climbs. This is where the alleged decision transforms from defensive to strategic. It wasn't about stopping a single future claim. It was about preventing a chain reaction. Because once the Spencer family appears even loosely connected to future narratives invoking Diana's authority, disentanglement becomes impossible without reputational damage. So they opted for preemption. Clean, silent, unambiguous. Now let's examine something people rarely talk about. Internal disagreement. Families like this don't act unless consensus is reached, which means this decision likely survived debate. Arguments for caution, arguments for compassion, arguments for optics. And yet, the decision still went through. That tells you how severe the perceived risk was. Because aristocratic families will tolerate discomfort. They will not tolerate loss of control. So what tipped the balance? It wasn't a single interview. It wasn't a single statement. It wasn't even a single project. It was accumulation. Accumulation of narrative weight. And narrative weight behaves like gravity. At some point, it pulls everything into its orbit. That's when you either reinforce your structure or get dragged along. The Spencers chose reinforcement. Here's the contradiction that confuses people. This decision wasn't anti-child. It was anti-ambiguity. Because ambiguity is the enemy of legacy. Ambiguity allows others to define meaning. And meaning is the most valuable asset Diana left behind. Now ask yourself something that feels uncomfortable. If the Spencer family believed they were about to be morally cornered by public expectation, wouldn't the crueler option be waiting? Waiting until the children were older. Waiting until claims were louder. Waiting until refusal caused pain. By acting early, they removed the possibility of future heartbreak at the cost of present outrage. That's how institutions think. They trade short-term discomfort for long-term control. Now let's look at what didn't happen. There was no family mediation announced. No symbolic gesture offered. No compromise leaked. Why? Because compromise creates precedent. And precedent creates leverage. The Spencer family does not negotiate legacy. They define it. That rigidity shocks modern audiences. But it's how families like this survive centuries. Flexibility erodes architecture. This brings us to the most unsettling implication of all. The Spencers didn't just act because something was happening. They acted because something was about to happen. Something that would make silence impossible. Something that would force them into a public position. And public positions are where aristocratic families lose. They are strongest when invisible. So they moved the battlefield before it could be chosen for them. Now let's talk about consequences. This decision doesn't just affect inheritance. It reshapes narrative boundaries. It signals to the world that Diana's legacy is not transferable through alignment, sympathy, or naming. It must be mediated by the family. That's a line drawn not in anger, but in ink. And ink outlives outrage. But here's where the story deepens. Because by acting now, the Spencers didn't just shut down one narrative. They exposed another. A narrative about how much pressure they felt was coming. Pressure strong enough to justify a move this severe. Which raises a dangerous question. What future story did they believe they were preventing? Because families don't redraw lines unless they see a storm approaching. And storms don't appear without warning. In the next section, we're going to examine the public silence that followed. Not the absence of outrage, but the absence of denial. Because when something this explosive happens and nobody rushes to correct it, that silence speaks louder than any statement ever could. And what it suggests may be the most revealing detail of all. Why didn't anyone deny it? That's the detail that keeps nagging at the edges of this story, refusing to be ignored. Because in a media ecosystem addicted to instant rebuttals, legal threats, and sources close to the family, silence is not neutral. Silence is a choice. And when multiple powerful parties choose it at the same time, it usually means one thing. Everyone understands the rules of the room. Let's start with what didn't happen. There was no swift clarification from the Spencer camp. No carefully worded line about misinterpretation. No anonymous briefing correcting the record. But just as telling was the silence elsewhere. No dramatic pushback. No legal posturing. No emphatic insistence that this was untrue. For a story this emotionally charged, that absence is deafening. Ask yourself something simple. If this claim were false, completely fabricated, how long would it take for someone to say so? Minutes? Hours? A day? Not long. Because false narratives are dangerous when they involve children, inheritance, and legacy. They invite sympathy. They create outrage. They spiral. And yet nothing. No denial. Which raises the question most people are avoiding. What if there was nothing to deny? This is where silence stops being passive and starts being communicative. In families like the Spencers, denial is not the default response to rumor. Silence is, because denying a story gives it oxygen. But silence only works when the underlying structure can withstand scrutiny. When the facts, if examined, would not contradict the narrative being allowed to circulate. That's the kind of silence that comes from confidence. Now let's examine the other side. Why wouldn't Meghan or Harry forcefully shut this down? After all, the story paints a picture of exclusion, rejection, and loss. Narratives they have historically pushed back against. So why not here? Why not correct the assumption? Why not protect the children from public speculation? Because sometimes pushing back confirms what you're trying to deny. If the legal reality is settled, irrevocable, and unchangeable, denial doesn't help. It invites questions you don't want asked. Questions about documents. Questions about clauses. Questions about timing. Questions about whether this decision was ever contestable in the first place. So silence becomes strategy. On both sides, the Spencers remain quiet because explanation invites debate, and debate invites pressure. The other side remains quiet because challenge invites proof, and proof invites finality. That's the stalemate. And stalemates only exist when both parties understand the terrain. Here's another uncomfortable truth. When powerful people are falsely accused, they rush to correct the record. When they are accurately described but unhappy about it, they go quiet. Silence is not admission, but it is acceptance of limits. Now think about the optics. If anyone publicly denied this and the denial was later undermined by documents, the damage would be catastrophic. Not just reputationally, legally. So no one moves. No one blinks. And the story sits there, unanswered, growing heavier by the day. This is where the public misreads silence as confusion. It isn't. It's calculation. Another detail worth noticing. No one framed this as a misunderstanding. No one suggested a future correction. No one hinted at ongoing discussions. Those phrases usually appear when outcomes are still fluid. Their absence suggests something else. Closure. Now let's talk about what silence protects. For the Spencers, silence protects authority. By not engaging, they reinforce the idea that their internal decisions are not subject to public negotiation. They don't explain their legacy. They enforce it. For Meghan and Harry, silence protects dignity. Because acknowledging exclusion publicly would require explaining why it happened. And explaining invites speculation about motive. Motive is where narratives spiral. So silence preserves ambiguity, even if the outcome is fixed. That's the paradox. Silence keeps the door closed without announcing the lock. Now consider the children again. Publicly denying the story might draw more attention to the idea that they were ever expected to inherit something from the Spencers, an expectation that may never have been legally grounded. Silence avoids correcting a misconception that, once corrected, might disappoint. Better to let the rumor float than confirm a reality people don't want to hear. This is how reputational damage is minimized, not eliminated. Minimized. Now let's address the emotional reaction many people have. Isn't this unfair? Isn't it cold? Isn't it cruel to let such a story circulate without clarification? From a human perspective, maybe. From an institutional perspective, no. Institutions don't manage feelings. They manage risk. And risk is amplified by speech. Silence shrinks the blast radius. There's also a legal dimension people overlook. Public statements can create expectations. Expectations can be cited. Cited expectations can become leverage in disputes. Silence creates no paper trail. And paper trails are how legacies unravel. Now ask yourself something revealing. Why do so many powerful families communicate through absence? Because absence can't be quoted. It can't be misinterpreted. It can't be subpoenaed. Silence leaves nothing to contest. And in this case, that matters more than public opinion. Here's another layer that deepens the tension. The silence isn't uniform. It's selective. Certain people speak. Certain institutions stay quiet. That pattern suggests alignment. Not conspiracy. Alignment. An understanding of boundaries. Everyone involved appears to know where those boundaries are, which means they were drawn clearly, and long ago. This brings us back to the idea that this decision didn't happen recently. The silence feels rehearsed because it is. When outcomes are anticipated, responses are prepared, including the response of saying nothing. This wasn't a scramble. It was execution. Now let's flip the perspective. What would have happened if the Spencers had issued a denial? They would have been dragged into a public conversation about. And that's when you know something is settled. Because unresolved issues generate noise. Resolved ones generate quiet. Now consider how rare that is in a family drama of this magnitude. Most conflicts leak. This one didn't. That tells you it wasn't a conflict. It was a decision. Decisions don't argue. They stand. Which leads us to the most revealing implication of all. If no one denies this, if no one corrects it, if no one reframes it, then the story has effectively been allowed to become the accepted version. And when powerful people allow a narrative to stand, it's usually because it doesn't threaten them, or because challenging it would expose something worse. That's the fork in the road. Either way, silence is protection. Protection of what? That's the question that pushes us into the next section. Because silence doesn't exist in a vacuum. It follows calculation. And calculation follows fear. So what exactly were all parties afraid of stirring up? Why was letting this story breathe less dangerous than shutting it down? And what does that tell us about the documents, decisions, and discussions that already exist behind closed doors? In the next section, we're going to examine the idea of entitlement. Not public entitlement. Private entitlement. The kind that families like the Spencers are obsessed with controlling. Because once entitlement takes root, legacy stops being preserved. It starts being claimed. And that is the one thing this family will never allow. Who decides who is entitled to what? And who decides when entitlement goes too far? That question sits at the heart of everything the Spencer family does. And once you understand how they think about entitlement, this entire situation stops looking emotional and starts looking structural. Because entitlement is the one thing old families fear more than scandal. Scandal fades. Entitlement spreads. And once it spreads, it's almost impossible to contain. Let's strip this down to its core. There is public entitlement, what people believe they deserve based on emotion, sympathy, or perception. And then there is private entitlement, what families recognize, authorize, and formalize behind closed doors. The gap between those two worlds is where most legacy conflicts are born. The public often assumes that proximity equals permission, that because someone is connected, they are entitled, that because a name is shared, something must follow, that because sympathy exists, obligation should too. But aristocratic families operate on a completely different logic. They assume nothing is owed until it is explicitly granted, and nothing is granted without conditions. Here's the contradiction that makes people uncomfortable. Entitlement feels natural in modern culture. It feels fair. It feels humane. But in legacy families, entitlement is treated like a virus. Unchecked, it mutates. It spreads from one person to the next, from symbolic recognition to moral pressure, from moral pressure to expectation, from expectation to demand. And once demand appears, control disappears. That's the line the Spencers refuse to cross. Because once entitlement is acknowledged, even indirectly, it never shrinks. It only grows. Now let's talk about how entitlement actually forms. It doesn't begin with lawyers. It begins with stories. Stories repeated often enough that they harden into belief. Beliefs shared widely enough that they become assumed truth. Assumed truths eventually become social contracts. And social contracts are far more powerful than legal ones. This is why the Spencer family monitors narrative so closely. Because narrative creates entitlement long before documents do. Look at how people talk about inheritance in this situation. They don't say, if the family chooses to include them. They say, of course they'll inherit something. That word, of course, is the danger. Of course is entitlement in its earliest form. It's casual. It's unexamined. And once it takes hold, reversing it feels cruel. This is why the alleged decision had to happen before, of course, became irreversible. Because families like the Spencers don't fight entitlement head-on. They suffocate it quietly. They remove the conditions that allow it to grow. Now consider something most people don't want to admit. Children inherit expectations before they inherit anything else. They inherit assumptions made on their behalf. They inherit narratives projected onto them. They inherit symbolic weight they never asked for. And in this case, that symbolic weight was enormous. The name Diana alone carries enough emotional gravity to bend public discourse. Add generational continuity to it, and suddenly you have a narrative that feels inevitable. Inevitable narratives are dangerous, because inevitability removes choice. And families like the Spencers obsess over choice. They believe legacy must always be chosen, not assumed. That's why inheritance is structured the way it is. Discretionary, conditional, fragmented. Not because they're cold, because they've learned what happens when lines blur. Let's talk precedent. Once one person is allowed to benefit from symbolic association, others will expect the same. Once one branch is acknowledged publicly, other branches will ask why they aren't. Once emotion enters the equation, logic loses authority. And authority is the backbone of legacy. This is why the Spencer family does not publicly reward alignment. They do not confirm expectations. They do not validate assumptions. They keep everything ambiguous until they don't. And when they clarify, they do it internally. That's what appears to have happened here. A clarification, not a punishment, not a rejection. A clarification of boundaries. And boundaries are everything in families like this. Because boundaries determine who gets to speak, who gets to represent, who gets to claim continuity. Once entitlement is allowed to form, boundaries collapse. Now let's address the uncomfortable accusation many people make. That this is unfair. That it punishes children for adult dynamics. That it weaponizes legacy against innocence. Those reactions come from a human lens. But institutions don't operate on human lenses. They operate on survival logic. They ask one question above all others. What decision today prevents chaos tomorrow? And often, the answer is a decision that feels harsh in the present. This is why entitlement is dealt with early. Before it becomes personal. Before it becomes public. Before it becomes impossible to reverse without damage. Here's another contradiction. By acting early, the Spencer family reduced emotional fallout. Because disappointment grows with expectation. If the public never fully believed inheritance was guaranteed, the eventual absence hurts less. But if belief solidifies and then collapses, the backlash is explosive. So the strategy is simple. Never allow belief to solidify. Never allow entitlement to mature. Now think about how silence plays into this. By not denying the story, the Spencers allow the idea that inheritance is not automatic to circulate. That idea is the antidote to entitlement. It reframes assumptions quietly. It recalibrates expectations without confrontation. And it reminds everyone watching that legacy is not crowdsourced. It's curated. This is also why no alternative narrative was offered. No special relationship. No future involvement. No honorary connection. Because those phrases plant entitlement seeds. Families like the Spencers don't plant seeds they don't intend to harvest. Now let's examine how entitlement becomes leverage. Once someone is perceived as an heir, even symbolically, they gain moral standing. Moral standing translates into influence. Influence invites negotiation. Negotiation implies shared authority. Shared authority erodes custodianship. That's the slippery slope the Spencers are obsessed with avoiding. Because once custodianship erodes, legacy becomes collaborative. And collaborative legacy is uncontrollable. Now consider the broader implication. This decision doesn't just affect one family. It sends a message to everyone orbiting Diana's legacy. You cannot inherit meaning by proximity alone. You cannot claim authority through alignment. You cannot leverage sympathy into obligation. That message is subtle, but it's unmistakable. And it's why the story has lingered without correction. Because correction would weaken the message. Now ask yourself something revealing. If entitlement were never forming, would this decision have been necessary? Probably not. Which means someone, somewhere, believed entitlement was forming. Believed that assumptions were crystallizing. Believed that future pressure was inevitable. And chose to cut it off at the root. This brings us back to the children and the tragedy of symbolism. Because children become vessels for narratives they didn't choose. And families like the Spencers believe the most ethical thing you can do is prevent that vessel from being filled. Even if it looks harsh from the outside. Even if it invites misunderstanding. Because misunderstanding is temporary. Entitlement is permanent. Now let's flip the question. What would have happened if the Spencers did nothing? The narrative would continue. Expectations would grow. The public would begin to speak as if inheritance were obvious. Any future refusal would look like betrayal. Any boundary would look like rejection. That's when families lose control. So they acted before the trap closed. And in doing so, they reminded everyone of an uncomfortable truth. Legacy is not inherited by default. It is protected by design. Which leads us to the next section. Because entitlement doesn't just appear out of nowhere. It is often encouraged, intentionally or not, by the way stories are told, by how parallels are drawn, by how history is framed, by how victimhood and continuity are intertwined. In the next chapter, we're going to examine the role narrative plays in creating entitlement, not through law, through storytelling. Because once you see how narratives are built, you'll understand why the Spencers reacted not to actions, but to trajectories. And why, once a trajectory is clear, waiting is the most dangerous option of all. How does a story quietly turn into a claim? That's the question that finally pulls the curtain back on everything you've heard so far. Because entitlement doesn't start with lawyers or documents. It starts with narrative, with repetition, with emotional framing that slowly reshapes what people believe is right. And once belief settles in, the fight is already lost. This is where the Spencer family's instincts become easier to understand, because they've seen this before. Not just with Diana, with history itself. Narrative is power, and power, once granted, is never voluntarily returned. Let's talk about how narratives are built. They don't arrive as demands. They arrive as stories. Stories told softly at first. Stories framed as concern. Stories that lean on empathy rather than assertion. No one says, "We are entitled." They say, "This reminds us of something that feels unresolved." That's how the ground shifts. Over time, unresolved becomes unfinished. Unfinished becomes owed. Owed becomes deserved. And suddenly, a narrative that began as reflection ends as expectation. This is why aristocratic families fear storytelling more than scandal. Scandal can be disproven. Stories can't. Because stories don't rely on facts alone. They rely on feeling. And feeling is impossible to litigate. Now think about how Diana's story is usually told. A woman wronged. A voice silenced. A system that failed her. Whether you agree with that framing or not, it carries enormous emotional force. And that force doesn't dissipate over time. It compounds. Each retelling sharpens the contrast between injustice and virtue. Each comparison reinforces the idea that history hasn't corrected itself. And that's where narrative becomes combustible. Because unresolved injustice demands resolution. Resolution requires agents. Agents require legitimacy. This is the invisible bridge between storytelling and entitlement. Now consider how modern media operates. It thrives on parallels, on echoes, on history repeating itself. Those phrases are not neutral. They imply that the present is the continuation of the past, and that the past wrongs are still active. When Diana's story is repeatedly invoked alongside contemporary conflicts, it does something subtle. It transfers moral authority. It suggests continuity of grievance. And once grievance is continuous, the torch must be carried by someone. That someone becomes a proxy. And proxies inherit expectation. This is the moment the Spencer family becomes alert. Because once Diana's narrative is positioned as ongoing, anyone framed as her successor gains symbolic leverage. Not legal leverage. Narrative leverage. And narrative leverage is far more dangerous. Now let's be clear. No one needs to intend this for it to happen. Narratives don't require coordination. They require momentum. Momentum builds when stories align emotionally. When people say, "This feels familiar." Familiarity is the seed of entitlement. Because familiarity breeds assumption. And assumption breeds obligation. This is why the Spencers reacted not to statements, but to framing. Not to claims, but to trajectories. They didn't need someone to say, "We deserve this." They only needed to see where the story was heading. And it was heading toward inevitability. Let's talk about inevitability for a moment. Inevitability is the most powerful narrative weapon. Once people believe an outcome is inevitable, any attempt to prevent it looks unnatural, cruel, unjust, wrong. That's how families lose agency. They wake up one day and realize the public believes something that was never agreed to. At that point, all choices are bad. So the only winning move is to act before inevitability sets in, before stories harden into truths, before sympathy transforms into pressure. This is why timing mattered so much. The Spencer family didn't act when the story was loud. They acted when it was coherent, when separate threads began weaving into a single narrative. A narrative where Diana's legacy wasn't just remembered, it was being positioned as transferable. And transferability is the red line. Because once legacy is transferable, it becomes divisible. Once it's divisible, it becomes negotiable. And once it's negotiable, it's no longer controlled by the family. That's the existential threat. Now think about the role children play in narratives. Children are moral accelerants. They intensify emotion. They soften skepticism. They make stories feel urgent. No one wants to question narratives involving children. That's why they're powerful. And that's also why institutions act quickly when children become symbolic carriers. Because once a child is framed as the continuation of a legacy, challenging that framing later looks heartless. So families intervene early, before innocence becomes instrument, before symbolism becomes destiny. This is where many people misunderstand the alleged decision. They see it as a reaction to names. But it wasn't the names. It was the narrative gravity those names attracted. One name connected to monarchy, one name connected to tragedy. Together, they formed a perfect emotional arc. An arc that could be extended indefinitely. An arc that positioned the next generation as inheritors of unfinished business. That arc had to be broken, not emotionally, structurally, because structures don't argue with stories. They outlast them. Now let's talk about how silence feeds narrative control. By refusing to engage publicly, the Spencers avoided validating the storyline. They didn't deny it. They didn't confirm it. They let it exist in a liminal space. And that space weakens narrative momentum. Because stories thrive on friction. They need pushback. They need conflict. They need villains. Silence denies them that fuel. It turns a dramatic arc into a procedural reality. And procedural realities don't inspire movements. They bore people. That's the point. Now consider how carefully this was executed. No emotional language. No moral framing. No symbolic gestures. Just administrative finality. That's how you neutralize narrative power. You don't fight it head-on. You drain it of oxygen. This is also why the story feels unsatisfying to many people. There's no catharsis. No resolution. No clear villain. Just a closed door. And closed doors frustrate audiences. But frustration fades. Structure remains. Here's another uncomfortable truth. The Spencer family understands media cycles better than people think. They know outrage burns fast. They know attention shifts. They know today's scandal is tomorrow's trivia. What doesn't fade is precedent. And precedent is what they were protecting. Now let's examine the idea of sabotage that people keep throwing around. Was this a sabotage of a plan? Only if you assume the plan existed in formal terms. More likely, this was a preemptive neutralization of a narrative trajectory. A trajectory that, if left unaddressed, would have created leverage without permission. From the Spencer perspective, that's not sabotage. That's defense. Defense of custodianship. Defense of meaning. Defense of a legacy they believe was already taken from them once. Because here's the thing that changes everything. The Spencers don't believe Diana's story belongs to the world. They believe the world borrowed it. And borrowing doesn't confer ownership. This belief underpins every decision they make. And it explains why they are willing to look cold to preserve control. Because losing control once was enough. Now ask yourself the hardest question of all. If you were in their position, guardians of a legacy that has already escaped your grasp once, would you risk letting it escape again? Or would you lock it down so tightly that no one could ever claim it without your consent? That's the choice they faced. And everything suggests they chose the latter. Which brings us to the next section. Because once narrative is neutralized, the focus shifts. From storytelling to consequence. From symbolism to fallout. What does this decision mean for Meghan? Not emotionally. Strategically. Because whether intentional or not, this move reshaped the terrain she operates on. And the impact of that shift goes far beyond inheritance. In the next chapter, we're going to examine how this decision hits at the core of narrative control and why it may have disrupted more than one carefully constructed storyline. Because when a legacy door closes, it doesn't just block entry. It changes the map. What happens when a narrative loses its anchor? That's the question that turns this story from inheritance drama into strategic earthquake. Because when the Spencer family allegedly closed that door, they didn't just block access to assets or symbolism. They altered the terrain. And terrain matters more than emotion ever will. Up to this point, much of the public conversation has focused on what was taken away. But that framing misses the deeper consequence. What was removed wasn't money. It wasn't property. It wasn't even lineage. It was leverage. Leverage built quietly through alignment. Leverage rooted in moral authority. Leverage that grows when stories feel unfinished and sympathetic. And when that leverage disappears, entire strategies have to be rewritten. Let's talk about narrative control, because this is where the impact go.